Right now, on a high-altitude ridge deep within the North Cascades of Washington state, a mountain is splitting in two. It is not eroding. It is not succumbing to the patient 10,000-year grind of glacial cycles or the slow bite of frost wedging. It is failing in real time. We are witnessing a geological expiration date played out on a human clock. To look at Sentinel Peak from the valley floor near the town of Marble Mount is to see a stoic 8,500-foot monument of ancient limestone and dolomite, seemingly eternal. But the visual is a lie. The only way to hear the truth of what is happening inside that stone is to press a high-frequency seismometer against the cold rock and listen for the shift. The mountain is screaming, but it is screaming at a frequency the human ear was never meant to register. In the summer of 2018, a specialized team of geophysicists from the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory and the University of Washington's Pacific Northwest Seismic Network ascended this peak. They weren't looking for volcanic tremors or deep tectonic subduction signals from the Cascadia Fault. They were there because the mountain was cracking from the inside out, and they needed to capture the acoustic fingerprint of its final collapse before it went. They deployed a ring of 7 ultra-sensitive seismic sensors around the summit of Sentinel Peak. What they found was a fracture that defied standard mountain safety protocols. A canyon has opened at the summit, a jagged wound now 20 feet wide, 115 feet long, and plunging 200 feet straight into the mountain's core. That is a gap wider than 6 garage doors, laid end to end, deeper than a 20-story skyscraper, driven like a wedge into the very foundation of the peak. Since 2014, the USGS has tracked this fracture, moving up to 10 millimeters every month without a single moment of pause. This isn't a maybe scenario. The southern mass of the summit has already subsided by several feet. It has not slowed down for the winter snows. It has not stabilized during the dry summers. The narrative often told to the public is that mountains might fall someday. But at Sentinel Peak, that story is dangerously incomplete. Part of it has already fallen, and what remains perched above the Skagit River Valley is what lead researchers describe as a close-to-failure system. The primary climbing route up the southern face, a trail used by mountaineers for over a century, was permanently closed by the National Park Service in 2014. The risk of spontaneous catastrophic rockfall has become impossible to manage. From certain vantage points on State Route 20, if the light hits the summit just right, you can see the shadow of the crack, a black line against the gray stone that marks the beginning of the end. The unstable mass above the sliding plane is currently divided into 6 distinct subunits. The largest is a monolithic block of 193,000 cubic yards. The total volume at risk is roughly 340,000 cubic yards, enough material to fill over 100 Olympic-sized swimming pools, poised to drop from 8,500 feet into the fragile valley below. The clock isn't just ticking, it's accelerating. At 7:22 a.m. on February 14, 2026, the real-time monitoring dashboard at the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington, flickered with a data packet that changed the risk profile of the entire Skagit Valley. It wasn't a volcanic eruption, but the signature was no less violent. High-precision GNSS sensors, Global Navigation Satellite System units, bolted directly into the limestone of Sentinel Peak, recorded a sudden 12-centimeter lateral offset in the main summit block. In the world of alpine geophysics, 12 centimeters in a single morning is not a movement, it is a rupture. This was the moment the sawtooth pattern, a phenomenon first identified by university researchers in 2024, finally broke its cycle. To understand the gravity of that February morning, we have to look at the anatomy of a failing mountain. For years, the monitoring team, led by Dr. Sarah Vance of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, PNSN, had observed a terrifyingly consistent rhythm. Using a network of 7 broadband seismometers, They track the peak's natural resonant frequency. Every solid object has a pitch at which it vibrates: a bell, a bridge, or a 200,000-ton block of rock. As the internal stress inside Sentinel Peak climbed, the frequency rose from 26 Hz to 29 Hz over a 5 to 7 day period. Then, as microscopic rock bridges inside the fracture snapped, the pressure would release, and the frequency would drop back down. This was the sawtooth, a visual representation of a mountain trying and failing to hold itself together. But by early 2026, the baseline was failing to recover. Every cycle ended lower than the last, meaning the internal structure was becoming permanently softer, more decoupled from the base. The cause is a lethal intersection of three factors: hydrostatic pressure, progressive fracturing, and topographic amplification. Sentinel Peak sits in a region of the North Cascades where the geology is a mass of fractured carbonate rock resting on a weak, inclined bedding plane. When heavy Pacific rain or rapid snowmelt enters that 200-foot deep crack, it acts as a hydraulic jack. The water doesn't just lubricate the slide, it exerts millions of pounds of outward pressure, pushing the block toward the abyss. This isn't theoretical. In the summer of 2016, a massive 150,000 cubic yard section of the southwestern face simply gave up. It didn't creep, it disintegrated in a multi-stage cliff fall that sent a plume of white dust visible from Marble Mount, 10 miles away. That event was a warning shot, a partial collapse that removed the physical toe or support for the larger summit block. Dr. Vance's 2025 report to the Washington State Department of Natural Resources stated the reality in chillingly clinical terms. The Sentinel Peak summit block is now a close-to-failure system. The 2016 event did not stabilize the peak. It unmasked the instability of the remaining 340,000 cubic yards. But the most alarming finding in the 2026 data is the role of seismic amplification. The specific geometry of the peak acts as a megaphone for tectonic energy. Data shows that a minor magnitude 3.0 earthquake on the nearby Darrington Devils Mountain fault zone, an event most people in Seattle wouldn't even feel, arrives at the summit of Sentinel Peak with a ground velocity amplified by a factor of up to 11. The mountain doesn't just shake, it whips. If that block is already at its limit, a whisper of a tremor becomes the final shove. The infrastructure at risk is staggering. Directly below the slide path lies State Route 20, the North Cascades Highway, a critical artery for tourism and regional transport. Below the road sits the Skagit River, a primary source of hydroelectric power and home to some of the most sensitive salmon spawning grounds in the United States. A total failure would release a volume of rock equivalent to a city block of skyscrapers, falling from 1.5 miles up. It wouldn't just block the road, it would create a temporary dam in the Skagit, followed by a catastrophic outburst flood. As the February 14th data showed, the fracture widening by more than 4 inches in a few hours, the question shifted from "will it fail?" to "how many minutes of warning do we actually have?" The USGS AlpSense equivalent platform, now rendering a real-time digital twin of the mountain, showed the fracture's internal rock bridges failing in a rapid-fire sequence. The mountain was no longer breathing, it was gasping. To grasp the scale of the impending failure at Sentinel Peak, one must look at the dark lineage of American geological disasters. We often think of the landscape as a static backdrop, but history proves that when mountains move, they do so with a velocity that renders human response times irrelevant. In June 1925, the Gros-Ventre slide in Wyoming saw 38 million cubic meters of debris, far larger than Sentinel's current threat, obliterate a valley in minutes, creating a natural dam that eventually burst, killing 6 people downstream. In 1959, the Madison Canyon landslide in Montana, triggered by a magnitude 7.2 earthquake, moved 28 million cubic meters of rock at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, burying a campground and creating Earthquake Lake. The nightmare for scientists at the USGS and the University of Washington is not just the volume of Sentinel Peak, but the speed of the transition. The 2014 Oso landslide in Washington state remains a sobering calibration case for US landslide research. There, a hillside that had been monitored and studied for decades underwent a catastrophic liquefaction. It didn't just slide, it moved as a high-velocity debris flow that claimed 43 lives and erased an entire neighborhood in seconds. Professor Michael Krautblatter's research, now heavily utilized by the Washington Geological Survey, points to a terrifying reality. The gap between detectable deformation and catastrophic release is narrowing as our sensing equipment gets better. We are seeing the warning signs, but the physics of the collapse may still outrun the logistics of an evacuation. The data gathered since 2016 reveals a system already in a state of cascading failure. While the public focus is on the 340,000 cubic yard summit block, the mountain has been shedding its skin for a decade. A peer-reviewed study published in Earth Surface Dynamics in 2024, adapted for the Cascades region by researchers at the USGS, traced the aftermath of the 2016 southwestern face collapse. That single event released up to 150,000 cubic yards of rock, half the size of the current threat, yet it barely made the local evening news in Seattle. The science, however, tells a different story. Over 600 individual rockfall events, larger than 1 cubic yard, were logged in the following seasons. The Jochbach equivalent in the Cascades, a primary tributary of the Skagit River, was slammed by a sediment pulse exceeding 400,000 cubic yards of material. This isn't just rock sitting at the bottom of a cliff. It is a sediment slug moving through the river system, raising the riverbed, destabilizing channel banks, and increasing the risk of flash flooding for every community downstream. The system is coupled. The 2016 collapse didn't relieve the pressure on the summit. It removed the structural buttress that held the base of the sliding plane. We are now looking at a close-to-failure mass, perched above a river system that is already choked with the debris of the last decade. If the summit block fails today, it will not hit a stable valley floor. It will hit a landscape already primed for a secondary disaster. The monitoring system's sawtooth signal is the heartbeat of this crisis. Every 5 to 7 days, the frequency of the mountain climbs as the internal stress builds, only to drop when microscopic rock bridges fail. But as of late 2025, the USGS crack meters, sensors capable of measuring movement to the thousandths of an inch, show that the recovery phase of the sawtooth has vanished. The mountain is no longer rebounding, it is stretching. Topographic amplification models suggest that the summit is now so fragile that the vibrations from a heavy freight train on the rail lines along the Skagit River or a moderate tremor from the Cascadia subduction zone could provide the final energy pulse needed for failure. The signal is no longer cyclic, it is terminal. We are watching a billion-pound clock, and the pendulum has stopped swinging. The human reality of a close-to-failure system is not found in the seismograms, but in the forced silence of the Skagit Valley. By the spring of 2026, the psychological weight of Sentinel Peak has become as heavy as the Dolomite itself. In the small community of Marble Mount, located just outside the projected debris runout zone, the atmosphere is one of suspended animation. Jim McCaslin, a third-generation rancher whose land sits along the banks of the Skagit River, represents a demographic caught in the crosshairs of geological timing. You look up at that summit every morning when you are moving the cattle, McCaslin said in a March 2026 interview with the Skagit Valley Herald. You can't help it. You see that black shadow, that crack, and you know the USGS is up there listening to it scream. It's like living at the foot of a guillotine and the rope is fraying. You don't know if the blade drops today or in 5 years, but you stop making long-term plans. For the Washington State Department of Transportation, WSDOT, the mountain is no longer a scenic landmark. It is a $240 million logistical liability. Elena Rodriguez, a lead engineer for WSDOT's North Central region, has spent the last 18 months managing the permanent closure of State Route 20 between New Halem and Winthrop. The closure of the North Cascades Highway isn't just a blow to tourism, Rodriguez noted in a technical briefing. It has severed a primary arterial for regional freight and emergency services. We've had to reroute everything through I-90 and US 2, adding hundreds of miles to supply chains and millions in fuel costs to the state's economy. But we cannot, in good conscience, keep a highway open when our sensors show the slope above it is moving at the speed of a fingernail growing, constantly, relentlessly, toward a catastrophic release. The logistical nightmare extends to the power grid. Seattle City Light operates a series of hydroelectric dams along the Skagit River, Gulch, Diablo, and Ross. These facilities provide roughly 20% of Seattle's electricity. A total failure of the Sentinel Peak summit block would trigger a massive sediment slug that could potentially reach the Gulch powerhouse. FEMA Region 10 has already drafted a worst-case scenario plan, estimating that a sudden landslide-induced flood or debris flow could cause over $1.2 billion in damage to infrastructure, including the total loss of the powerhouse and the destabilization of downstream bridges. This isn't a single-point failure, a 2026 FEMA internal memo reads. It is a system-wide collapse. We are looking at the simultaneous loss of a major state highway, a critical hydroelectric node, and the potential displacement of 1,200 residents in the immediate floodplain. The physical act of monitoring this collapse has taken a toll on the scientists themselves. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a USGS field technician who has spent more time on the ridge of Sentinel Peak than perhaps anyone else, describes the experience as haunting. A simulated transcript from a late 2025 field check captures the tension. Thorne: Sensor 7 is showing a persistent tilt. We are seeing 15 mm of separation on the primary crack meter in the last 72 hours. Base: Copy that, Marcus. Is there audible activity? Thorne: Yes. It's not a rumble. It's a series of sharp metallic pops. Like a dry branch snapping, but deep. You can feel it in your boots through the rock. It's the internal rock bridges failing. We are packing up. We shouldn't be here. The ecological consequences are equally dire. The Skagit River is the only river system in the lower 48 states that supports all 5 species of native Pacific salmon. A massive landslide would dump 340,000 cubic yards of limestone and dolomite directly into the headwaters. The resulting turbidity and pH shift would be lethal. We are talking about the potential extinction of local spawning grounds, says Sarah Miller, a biologist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. The river wouldn't just be muddy, it would be physically transformed. The sediment load from the 2016 event is still moving through the system. A full collapse would be the final blow to the Skagit's recovery efforts. We would be looking at a dead river for a generation. As of April 2026, the red zone evacuation orders remain in place for seasonal cabins and campgrounds along the upper Skagit. The local economy is reeling, with property values in the Marble Mount area plummeting by 40% as insurance companies begin to pull out of high-risk landslide corridors. The cost of doing nothing is zero, but the cost of the event is incalculable. Telecom providers like T-Mobile and AT&T have already reported that the fiber optic lines running alongside SR20 are at risk. A break there would sever high-speed communication for dozens of inland communities. Every coupled system, power, transport, ecology, and communication, is waiting for the mountain to make the first move. The sensors are ready. The digital twin is updated every 10 minutes. The scientists are watching, but for the people in the valley, the data offers no comfort. It only confirms that the world they built at the foot of Sentinel Peak is no longer theirs to keep. The fracture at Sentinel Peak is not just a localized failure. It is the opening chapter of a new geophysical reality for the American West. As we move further into 2026, the data suggests that Sentinel is a prototype. Across the North Cascades, from Mount Baker down to the Goat Rocks wilderness, the AlpSense monitoring protocols are being rapidly exported to other peaks that show similar signs of structural fatigue. The combination of losing high-altitude permafrost glue and the increasing frequency of rain-on-snow events is turning the rugged backbone of Washington state into a gallery of unstable monoliths. Sentinel Peak is simply the one that is closest to the edge. The vulnerability of the Skagit hydroelectric project remains the most acute concern for regional planners. If the 340,000 cubic yard summit block releases in a single catastrophic event, the kinetic energy alone would be equivalent to several kilotons of TNT. When that mass hits the valley floor, it won't just sit there. It will convert into a debris flow, a slurry of rock, pulverized timber, and ice that will move with the viscosity of wet concrete and the speed of a freight train. The USGS models for Cascading Failure 2026 predict that the debris will reach the Skagit River in under 90 seconds. This is the compression of the interval that Dr. Michael Dietz warned about. The sensors can detect the failure in milliseconds, but human response, evacuating a downstream campground or shutting down a powerhouse, requires minutes that the mountain may not provide. The ripple effects extend all the way to the Pacific coast. The Skagit River eventually empties into Skagit Bay, near the critical refinery corridor of Anacortes. The massive sediment slug, initiated by Sentinel Peak collapse, would take years to migrate downstream, but its arrival would be transformative. The sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of dolomite silt would necessitate emergency dredging of navigation channels to keep the port of Anacortes and the nearby naval stations operational. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has already begun preliminary surveys to determine how a massive sediment pulse would impact the Salish Sea's delicate bathymetry. This is the definition of a coupled system. A crack in a rock 100 miles inland can eventually dictate the draft depth of an oil tanker or a destroyer. But the most chilling forecast involves the Great Quake, the long overdue M9.0 Cascadia subduction zone event. Geologists now understand that our mountain ranges are not independent of our fault lines. If the Cascadia fault ruptures while Sentinel Peak is in its terminal sawtooth phase, the topographic amplification will be the final violent shove. A mountain already at 99% of its breaking point cannot survive a minute of intense seismic shaking. In that scenario, Sentinel Peak wouldn't be the only one to go. We would be looking at a synchronized collapse of multiple high-risk slopes across the Pacific Northwest, creating a multi-hazard emergency that would overwhelm FEMA and the National Guard's ability to respond. The digital twin of Sentinel Peak, maintained by the Technical University of Munich's partner program at the University of Washington, continues to refresh its 3D render every 10 minutes. On the screen, the fracture is highlighted in deep red, a jagged line that pulsates with every new millimeter of displacement. It is a masterpiece of modern engineering, a system that can see through solid stone to the very rock bridges that are currently snapping. Yet, for all its sophistication, the technology has reached its limit. It can provide the data, but it cannot change the physics. The dolomite doesn't care about the digital twin. Gravity does not negotiate with crack meters. The seismometers around the 8,500-foot summit are waiting for one specific sound, the terminal cluster. In the final moments of a failure, the seismic emissions stop being rhythmic and start to accelerate into a continuous roar. The sawtooth stops recovering. The frequency turns into a flat line of high-energy noise. When that signal arrives at the USGS observatory, it will be the last piece of data the sensors ever transmit. As we look toward the remainder of 2026, the policy of managed retreat from the high Cascades is becoming the only viable option. We are learning to listen to the mountains, and what they are saying is that the era of alpine stability is over. The fracture is still opening, the southern face is still subsiding, the water is still pushing. What happens in the valley between the detection of the signal and the arrival of the debris is the only variable left in the equation. Follow the data, because the mountain is no longer waiting for us to catch up.